The community of the higher realms that is fixated upon God is secure in the knowledge that as an oriented community, both in time and for all eternity, it lives within and beyond the law, occupying the perpetually untenable middle ground between the natural and the supernatural. It not only presents itself in this paradoxical situation, but also experiences and names it as well. In spheres of lesser reality, consciousness of existence and of the authentic conditions dwindles away in the existential stream, and clouded sense becomes lost in the labyrinth of distorted events whose distortion it no longer perceives. The aesthetic rendering of such a life bereft of reality, a life that has lost the power of self-observation, may be able to restore to it a sort of language. For even if the artist does not force all that has become mute and illusory directly up into reality, he does express his directed self by giving form to this life. The more life is submerged, the more it needs the artwork, which unseals its withdrawnness and puts its pieces back in place in such a way that these, which were lying strewn about, become organized in a meaningful way. The unity of the aesthetic construct, the manner in which it distributes the emphases and consolidates the event, gives a voice to the inexpressive world, gives meaning to the themes broached within it. Just what these themes mean, however, must still be brought out through translation, and depends to no small extent on the level of reality evinced by their creator. Thus, while in the higher spheres the artist confirms a reality that grasps itself, in the lower regions his work becomes a harbinger of a manifold that utterly lacks any revelatory word. His tasks multiply in proportion to the world's loss of reality, and the cocoon-like spirit, or Geist, that lacks access to reality ultimately imposes upon him the role of educator, of the observer who not only sees, but also prophetically foresees and makes connections. Although this overloading of the aesthetic may well accord the artist a mistaken position, it is understandable, because the life that remains untouched by authentic things recognizes that it has been captured in the mirror of the artistic construct, and thereby gains consciousness, albeit negative, of its distance from reality and of its illusory status. For no matter how insignificant the existential power that gives rise to the artistic formation may be, it always infuses the muddled material with intentions that help it become transparent. Without being an artwork, the detective novel still shows civilized society its own face in a purer way than society is usually accustomed to seeing it. In the detective novel, proponents of that society and their functions give an account of themselves and divulge their hidden significance. But the detective novel can coerce the self-shrouding world into revealing itself in this manner only because it is created by a consciousness that is not circumscribed by that world. Sustained by this consciousness, the detective novel really thinks through to the end the society dominated by autonomous ratio, a society that exists only as a concept, and develops the initial moments it proposes in such a way that the idea is fully realized in actions and figures. Once the stylization of the one-dimensional unreality has been completed, the detective novel integrates the individual elements, now adequate to the constitutive presuppositions, into a self-contained coherence of meaning, an integration it effects through the power of its existentiality, the latter transformed not into critique and exigency, but into principles of aesthetic composition. It is only this entwinement into a unity that really makes possible the interpretation of the presented findings. For, like the philosophical system, the aesthetic organism aims at a totality that remains veiled to the proponents of civilized society, a totality that in some ways disfigures the entirety of experienced reality, and thereby enables one to see it afresh. Thus, the true meaning of these findings can be found only in the way in which they combine into an aesthetic totality. This is the minimum achievement of the artistic entity, to construct a whole out of the blindly scattered elements of a disintegrated world. A whole that, even if it seems only to mirror this world, nevertheless does capture it in its wholeness, and thereby allows for the projection of its elements onto real conditions. The fact that the structure of the life presented in the detective novel is so typical indicates that the consciousness producing it is not an individual, coincidental one. At the same time, it shows that what has been singled out are these seemingly metaphysical characteristics. Just as the detective discovers the secret that people have concealed, the detective novel discloses in the aesthetic medium the secret of a society bereft of reality, as well as the secret of its insubstantial marionettes. The composition of the detective novel transforms an ungraspable life into a translatable analog of actual reality. In The House of God, which presupposes an already extant community, the congregation accomplishes the task of making connections. Once the members of the congregation have abandoned the relation on which the place is founded, the house of God retains only a decorative significance. Even if it sinks into oblivion, civilized society, at the height of its development, still maintains privileged sites that testify to its own non-existence, just as the house of God testifies to the existence of the community united in reality. Admittedly, society is unaware of this, for it cannot see beyond its own sphere. Only the aesthetic construct, whose form renders the manifold as a projection, makes it possible to demonstrate this correspondence. The typical characteristics of the hotel lobby, which appears repeatedly in detective novels, indicate that it is conceived as the inverted image of the house of God. It is a negative church, and can be transformed into a church so long as one observes the conditions that govern the different spheres. In both places, people appear there as guests. But whereas the house of God is dedicated to the service of the one whom people have gone there to encounter, the hotel lobby accommodates all who go there to meet no one. It is the setting for those who neither seek nor find the one who is always sought, and who are therefore guests in space as such, a space that encompasses them and has no function other than to encompass them. The impersonal nothing represented by the hotel manager here occupies the position of the unknown one, in whose name the church congregation gathers. And whereas the congregation invokes the name and dedicates itself to the service in order to fulfill the relation, the people dispersed in the lobby accept their hosts incognito, without question. Lacking any and all relation, they drip down into the vacuum with the same necessity that compels those striving in and for reality to lift themselves out of the nowhere toward their destination. The congregation, which gathers in the house of God for prayer and worship, outgrows the imperfection of communal life in order not to overcome it, but to bear it in mind and to reinsert it constantly into the tension. Its gathering is a collectedness and a unification of this directed life of the community, which belongs to two realms, the realm covered by law and the realm beyond law. At the site of the church, but of course not only here, these separate currents encounter each other. The law is broached here without being breached, and the paradoxical split is accorded legitimacy by the sporadic suspension of its languid continuity. Through the edification of the congregation, the community is always reconstructing itself, and this elevation above the everyday prevents the everyday itself from going under. The fact that such a returning of the community to its point of origin must submit to spatial and temporal limitations, that it steers away from worldly community, and that it is brought about through special celebrations. This is only a sign of man's dubious position between above and below, one that constantly forces him to establish on his own what is given or what has been conquered in the tension. Since the determining characteristic of the lower region is its lack of tension, the togetherness in the hotel lobby has no meaning. While here, too, people certainly do become detached from everyday life, this detachment does not lead the community to assure itself of its existence as a congregation. Instead, it merely displaces people from the unreality of the daily hustle and bustle to a place where they would encounter the void only if they were more than just reference points. The lobby, in which people find themselves vis-à-vis du rien, is a mere gap that does not even serve a purpose dictated by ratio, like the conference room of a corporation. A purpose which, at the very least, could mask the directive that had been perceived in the relation. But if a sojourn in a hotel offers neither a perspective on nor an escape from the everyday, it does provide a groundless distance from it, which can be exploited, if at all, aesthetically. The aesthetic being understood here as a category of the non-existent type of person, the residue of that positive aesthetic which makes it possible to put this non-existence into relief in the detective novel. The person sitting around idly is overcome by a disinterested satisfaction in the contemplation of a world creating itself, whose purposiveness is felt without being associated with any representation of a purpose. The Kantian definition of the beautiful is instantiated here in a way that takes seriously its isolation of the aesthetic and its lack of content. For in the emptied-out individuals of the detective novel, who, as rationally constructed complexes, are comparable to the transcendental subject, the aesthetic faculty is indeed detached from the purely existential stream of the total person. It is reduced to an unreal, purely formal relation that manifests the same indifference to the self as it does to matter. Kant himself was able to overlook this horrible last-minute sprint of the transcendental subject since he still believed there was a seamless transition from the transcendental to the preformed subject-object world. The fact that he does not completely give up the total person, even in the aesthetic realm, is confirmed by his definition of the sublime, which takes the ethical into account and thereby attempts to reassemble the remaining pieces of the fractured whole. In the hotel lobby, admittedly, the aesthetic, lacking all qualities of sublimity, is presented without any regard for these upward-striving intentions, and the formula purposiveness without purpose also exhausts its content. Just as the lobby is the space that does not refer beyond itself, the aesthetic condition corresponding to it constitutes itself as its own limit. It is forbidden to go beyond this limit, so long as the tension that would propel the breakthrough is repressed, and the marionettes of ratio, who are not human beings, isolate themselves from their bustling activity. But the aesthetic that has become an end in itself pulls up its own roots. It obscures the higher level toward which it should refer and signifies only its own emptiness, which, according to the literal meaning of the Kantian definition, is a mere relation of faculties. It rises above a meaningless formal harmony only when it is in the service of something, when instead of making claims to autonomy, it inserts itself into the tension that does not concern it in particular. If human beings orient themselves beyond the form, then a kind of beauty may also mature that is a fulfilled beauty, because it is the consequence and not the aim. But where beauty is chosen as an aim without further consequences, all that remains is its empty shell. Both the hotel lobby and the house of God respond to the aesthetic sense that articulates its legitimate demands in them. But whereas in the latter, the beautiful employs a language with which it also testifies against itself, in the former it is involuted in its muteness, incapable of finding the other. In tasteful lounge chairs, a civilization intent on rationalization comes to an end, whereas the decorations of the church pews are born from the tension that accords them a revelatory meaning. As a result, the chorales that are the expression of the divine service turn into medleys whose strains encourage pure triviality, and devotion congeals into erotic desire that roams about without an object. The equality of those who pray is likewise reflected in distorted form in the hotel lobby. When a congregation forms, the differences between people disappear because these beings all have one and the same destiny, and because, in the encounter with the spirit that determines this destiny, anything that does not determine that spirit simply ceases to exist, namely the limit of necessity posited by man and the separation, which is the work of nature. The provisional status of communal life is experienced as such in the house of God, and so the sinner enters into the we in the same way as does the upright person, whose assurance here is disturbed. This, the fact that everything human is oriented toward its own contingency, is what creates the equality of the contingent. The great pales next to the small, and good and evil remain suspended when the congregation relates itself to that which no scale can measure. Such a relativization of qualities does not lead to their confusion, but instead elevates them to the status of reality, since the relation to the last things demands that the penultimate things be convulsed without being destroyed. This equality is positive and essential, not a reduction and foreground. It is the fulfillment of what has been differentiated, which must renounce its independent singular existence in order to save what is most singular. This singularity is awaited and sought in the house of God. Relegated to the shadows so long as merely human limits are imposed, it throws its own shadow over those distinctions when man approaches the absolute limit. In the hotel lobby, equality is based not on a relation to God, but on a relation to the nothing. Here, in the space of unrelatedness, the change of environments does not leave purposive activity behind, but brackets it for the sake of a freedom that can refer only to itself, and therefore sinks into relaxation and indifference. In the house of God, human differences diminish in the face of their provisionality, exposed by a seriousness that dissipates the certainty of all that is definitive. By contrast, an aimless lounging to which no call is addressed leads to the mere play that elevates the unserious every day to the level of the serious. Georg Simmel's definition of society as a, quote, play form of sociation is entirely legitimate, but does not get beyond mere description. What is presented in the hotel lobby is the formal similarity of the figures, an equivalence that signifies not fulfillment, but evacuation. Removed from the hustle and bustle, one does gain some distance from the distinctions of, quote, actual life, but without being subjected to a new determination that would circumscribe from above the sphere of validity for these determinations. And it is in this way that a person can vanish into an undetermined void, helplessly reduced to a, quote, member of society as such, who stands superfluously off to the side and, when playing, intoxicates himself. This invalidation of togetherness, itself already unreal, thus does not lead up toward reality, but is more of a sliding down into the doubly unreal mixture of the undifferentiated atoms from which the world of appearance is constructed. Whereas in the house of God, a creature emerges which sees itself as a supporter of the community, in the hotel lobby what emerges is the inessential foundation at the basis of rational socialization. It approaches the nothing and takes shape by analogy with the abstract, formal, universal concepts through which thinking that is escaped from the tension believes it can grasp the world. These abstractions are inverted images of the universal concepts conceived within the relation. They rob the ungraspable given of its possible content, instead of raising it to the level of reality by relating it to the higher determinations. They are irrelevant to the oriented and total person, who, the world in hand, meets them halfway. Rather, they are posited by the transcendental subject which allows them to become part of the powerlessness into which that transcendental subject degenerates as a result of its claim to be creator of the world. Even if free-floating ratio, dimly aware of its limitation, does acknowledge the concepts of God, freedom, and immortality, what it discovers are not the homonymic existential concepts, and the categorical imperative is surely no substitute for a commandment that arises out of an ethical resolution. Nevertheless, the weaving of these concepts into a system confirms that people do not want to abandon the reality that has been lost. Yet, of course, they will not get hold of it, precisely because they are seeking it by means of a kind of thinking which has repudiated all attachment to that reality. The desolation of ratio is complete only when it removes its mask and hurls itself into the void of random abstractions that no longer mimic higher determinations, and when it renounces seductive consonances and desires itself even as a concept. The only immediacy it then retains is the now openly acknowledged nothing, in which, grasping upward from below, it tries to ground the reality to which it no longer has access. Just as God becomes, for the person situated in the tension, the beginning and end of all creation, so too does the intellect that has become totally self-absorbed create the appearance of a plenitude of figures from zero. It thinks it can wrench the world from this meaningless universal, which is situated closest to that zero, and distinguishes itself from it only to the extent necessary in order to deduct a something. But the world is world only when it is interpreted by a universal that has been really experienced. The intellect reduces the relations that permeate the manifold to the common denominator of the concept of energy, which is separated merely by a thin layer from the zero. Or it robs historical events of their paradoxical nature, and, having leveled them out, grasps them as progress in one-dimensional time. Or, seemingly betraying itself, it elevates irrational, quote, life to the dignified status of an entity in order to recover itself in its delimitation from the now liberated residue of the totality of human being, and in order to traverse the realms across their entire expanse. If one takes as one's basis these extreme reductions of the real, then, as Simmel's philosophy of life confirms, one can obtain a distorted image of the discoveries made in the upper spheres, an image that is no less comprehensive than the one provided by the insistence of the words, quote, God and, quote, Spirit. But even less ambiguously than the abusive employment of categories that have become incomprehensible, it is the deployment of empty abstractions that announces the actual position of a thinking that has slipped out of the tension. The visitors in the hotel lobby, who allow the individual to disappear behind the peripheral equality of social masks, correspond to the exhausted terms that coerce differences out of the uniformity of the zero. Here, the visitors suspend the undetermined special being, which, in the house of God, gives way to that invisible equality of being standing before God, out of which it both renews and determines itself, by devolving into tuxedos, and the triviality of their conversation, haphazardly aimed at utterly insignificant objects so that one might encounter oneself in their exteriority, is only the obverse of prayer, directing downward what they idly circumvent. The observance of silence, no less obligatory in the hotel lobby than in the house of God, indicates that in both places people consider themselves essentially as equals. In Death in Venice, Thomas Mann formulates this as follows, quote, a solemn stillness reigned in the room, of the sort that is the pride of all large hotels. The attentive waiters moved about on noiseless feet. A rattling of the tea service, a half-whispered word, was all that one could hear. Unquote. The contentless solemnity of this conventionally imposed silence does not arise out of mutual courtesy, of the sort one encounters everywhere, but rather serves to eliminate differences. It is a silence that abstracts from the differentiating word and compels one downward into the equality of the encounter with the nothing, an equality that a voice resounding through space would disturb. In the house of God, by contrast, silence signifies the individual collecting himself as firmly directed self, and the word addressed to human beings is effaced solely in order to release another word, which, whether uttered or not, sits in judgment over human beings. Since what counts here is not the dialogue of those who speak, the members of the congregation are anonymous. They outgrow their names, because the very empirical being which these names designate disappears in prayer. Thus, they do not know one another as particular beings whose multiply determined existences enmesh them in the world. If the proper name reveals its bearer, it also separates him from those whose names have been called. It simultaneously discloses and obscures. And it is with good reason that lovers want to destroy it, as if it were the final wall separating them. It is only the relinquishing of the name, which abolishes the semi-solidarity of the intermediate spheres, that allows for the extensive solidarity of those who step out of the bright obscurity of reciprocal contact and into the night and the light of the higher mystery. Now that they do not know who the person closest to them is, their neighbor becomes the closest, for out of his disintegrating appearance arises a creation whose traits are also theirs. It is true that only those who stand before God are sufficiently estranged from one another to discover they are brothers. Only they are exposed to such an extent that they can love one another without knowing one another and without using names. At the limit of the human, they rid themselves of their naming so that the word might be bestowed upon them, a word that strikes them more directly than any human law. And in the seclusion to which such a relativization of form generally pushes them, they inquire about their form. Having been initiated into the mystery that provides the name, and having become transparent to one another in their relationship to God, they enter into the we, signifying a commonality of creatures that suspends and grounds all those distinctions and associations, adhering to the proper name. This limit case we of those who have dispossessed themselves of themselves, a we that is realized vicariously in the house of God due to human limitations, is transformed in the hotel lobby into the isolation of anonymous atoms. Here, profession is detached from the person, and the name gets lost in the space, since only the still unnamed crowd can serve ratio as a point of attack. It reduces to the level of the nothing, out of which it wants to produce the world, even those pseudo-individuals it has deprived of individuality, since their anonymity no longer serves any purpose other than meaningless movement along the paths of convention. But if the meaning of this anonymity becomes nothing more than the representation of the insignificance of this beginning, the depiction of formal regularities, then it does not foster the solidarity of those liberated from the constraints of the name. Instead, it deprives those encountering one another of the possibility of association that the name could have offered them. Remnants of individuals slip into the nirvana of relaxation. Faces disappear behind newspapers, and the artificial continuous light illuminates nothing but mannequins. It is the coming and going of unfamiliar people who have become empty forms because they have lost their password, and who now file by as ungraspable, flat ghosts. If they possessed an interior, it would have no windows at all, and they would perish aware of their endless abandonment, instead of knowing of their homeland as the congregation does. But as pure exterior, they escape themselves and express their non-being through the false aesthetic affirmation of the estrangement that has been installed between them. The presentation of the surface strikes them as an attraction. The tinge of exoticism gives them a pleasurable shudder. Indeed, in order to confirm the distance whose definitive character attracts them, they allow themselves to be bounced off a proximity that they themselves have conjured up. Their monological fantasy attaches designations to the masks, designations that use the person facing them as a toy. And the fleeting exchange of glances, which creates the possibility of exchange, is acknowledged only because the illusion of that possibility confirms the reality of the distance. Just as in the house of God, here too namelessness unveils the meaning of naming. But whereas in the house of God, it is an awaiting within the tension that reveals the preliminariness of names, in the hotel lobby, it is a retreat into the unquestioned groundlessness that the intellect transforms into the name's site of origin. But where the call that unifies into the we is not heard, those that have fled the form are irrevocably isolated. In the congregation, the entire community comes into being, for the immediate relation to the supra-legal mystery inaugurates the paradox of the law that can be suspended in the actuality of the relation to God. That law is a penultimate term that withdraws when the connection occurs that humbles the self-assured and comforts those in danger. The tensionless people in the hotel lobby also represent the entire society, but not because transcendence here raises them up to its level. Rather, this is because the hustle and bustle of immanence is still hidden. Instead of guiding people beyond themselves, the mystery slips between the masks. Instead of penetrating the shells of the human, it is the veil that surrounds everything human. Instead of confronting man with the question of the provisional, it paralyzes the questioning that gives access to the realm of provisionality. In his all-too contemplative detective novel, Der Tod kehrt im Hotel ein, Death Enters the Hotel, Sven Elvestad writes, quote, "Once again it is confirmed that a large hotel is a world unto itself, and that this world is like the rest of the large world. The guests here roam about in their light-hearted, careless summer existence, without suspecting anything of the strange mysteries circulating among them." Unquote. Quote, strange mysteries. The phrase is ironically ambiguous. On the one hand, it refers quite generally to the disguised quality of lived existence as such. On the other, it refers to the higher mystery that finds distorted expression in the illegal activities that threaten safety. The clandestine character of all legal and illegal activities, to which the expression initially and immediately refers, indicates that in the hotel lobby, the pseudo-life that is unfolding in pure immanence is being pushed back toward its undifferentiated origin. Were the mystery to come out of its shell, mere possibility would disappear in the fact. By detaching the illegal from the nothing, the something would have appeared. The hotel management therefore thoughtfully conceals from its guests the real events which could put an end to the false aesthetic situation, shrouding that nothing. Just as the formerly experienced higher mystery pushes those oriented toward it across the midpoint, whose limit is defined by the law, so does the mystery, which is the distortion of the higher ground, and as such the utmost abstraction of the dangers that disrupt immanent life, relegate one to the lapsed neutrality of the meaningless beings from which the pseudo-middle arises. It hinders the outbreak of differentiations in the service of emancipated ratio, which strengthens its victory over the something in the hotel lobby by helping the conventions take the upper hand. These are so worn out that the activity taking place in their name is at the same time an activity of dissimulation, an activity that serves as protection for legal life just as much as for illegal life. Because, as the empty form of all possible societies, it is not oriented toward any particular thing, but remains content with itself in its insignificance.